Hello everybody, welcome to the Scottish Summit. My name is Shahbaz Dar and today's presentation for me is going to be around Azure Identity Management. Before I get started with all content, I'd like to give a quick shout out to the Scottish Summit sponsors. Thank you to all the sponsors for sponsoring the event. Obviously these events are very difficult to put together, and it's thanks to these type of sponsors that help the organisers in putting it all together. So thank you to ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Redspire, Agilisys and Hitachi Solutions. A big thank you to all those sponsors. So I'll quickly give an introduction about myself. So my name is Shahbaz Dar. I work for Netcompany as a senior infrastructure consultant. My main sort of focus points are Windows Virtual Desktop, Endpoint Manager and Azure. I've done a fair bit of public speaking the last 6 months, mainly at user groups. So this is one of my first conferences, so I'm very excited. I'm a keen blogger, so you can find my blog on imitgeek.com. I've also got my own YouTube channel where I do weekly videos, again different subjects all around cloud, which is again youtube.com imitgeek. And for everyone who's watching live, or even if you're watching one of the recorded sessions, get on social media and use the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021 to show support, and obviously tag me if I'm on as at Shahbaz Dar, so don't forget to tag me in your tweets. But yeah, I would love your support, and hashtagging the Scottish Summit 2021 will help with that support. So moving on, my presentation, as I mentioned at the beginning, is going to be around Azure Identity Management. In my experience, there are 3 areas really that are available to us when it comes to identity management in Azure. We have Azure AD, which is like your cloud-based identity management. We have Hybrid Identity, which involves both Azure AD and Active Directory on premises. And then we have Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is essentially a domain controller as a service that's available within Azure. And so in my presentation, I'll go through each of these in greater detail and show and explain exactly how they look and feel within Azure. So in the first section, I'm going to go into some details around Azure Active Directory, including what is Azure Active Directory, some of the licensing requirements around Azure Active Directory, the positives, the pros of Azure AD, and including the benefits, but also some of the negatives around it, some of the cons of Azure AD. So I'll explain what both those are in a bit of detail. So what is Azure AD or Azure Active Directory exactly? So it's Microsoft's cloud-based identity management service. And it has integration with a lot of the SaaS products within Microsoft 365, including Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Microsoft Teams, just to name a few of the services. Like most cloud services, Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, has different levels of features, all dependent on the subscription you assign, the user, or the license level the user has. You can secure Azure AD Cloud with multi-factor authentication, which is another layer of security for your users. And you can assign Intune policies to Azure AD user accounts for compliance and configuration on your Windows 10 devices that you enroll within your tenant. So it's got that integration with like your MDM platform within Azure AD as well. So next, let's take a look at some of the licensing requirements around Azure Active Directory. So we start off with the Azure AD Basic license, which is the free license. And this provides user and group management, self-service password change for cloud users only, and single sign-on capabilities within Azure Office 365 and certain third-party SaaS apps. You can also have integration with on-premises Active Directory, but I'll discuss that further in the hybrid section. Next, we've got Azure AD Premium 1 or Azure AD P1. It has all the same features and capabilities as the free version, but has more support with hybrid users, advanced administration, including dynamic groups and cloud password write-back capabilities. Third, we have Azure AD Premium 2 or Azure AD P2. And this has all the same features and capabilities as the Premium 1 license, but also Premium 2 offers Active Directory identity protection to help provide risk-based conditional access to your applications and your critical company data. So that's quite an interesting feature. Finally, there's a pay-as-you-go feature license. So these are additional feature licenses such as Active Directory Business to Customer or B2C. And B2C can help provide identity and access management solutions for your customer-facing applications. So again, that's the fourth type of license you can get. So let's move on to the pros of Azure Active Directory. So Azure AD is highly available by architecture design spread across multiple data centers in different locations around the globe. It is consisted of independent building blocks to they provide the scale and the availability to make it highly available. It's got like a centralized administration of users through different locations, all in one pane of glass. If you think about Active Directory on premises, you've got your different forests and your different domains, and a lot of the time it's difficult to see all those under one pane of glass. Whereas with Azure AD, it doesn't separate them within OU or any different domain. They're all just available under one pane of glass of management, so it makes it much more easier to manage for your admins. So with One Identity, you can access thousands of SaaS applications and on-premises applications using single sign-on. You can achieve single sign-on to your on-premises applications as well using the password authentication or the federation. And again, we'll discuss that more in the hybrid section. But yeah, single sign-on is a massive benefit and pro of Azure Active Directory. And finally, the Azure AD reporting. So it provides rich and security and activity reports. Again, if you've got experience within Active Directory on premises, my personal experience anyway is it's very difficult to get really granular reporting with ease. And within Azure AD, the reporting is amazing. It's very clear, it's very easy to access, and easier to export for when you need to show it to your directors, or if there's a security incident. It's really easy to get the reports. So that's a big positive for me. So although it's Azure AD is a great service, unfortunately it does, like most things, have some downsides to it, some cons. So although in the pros, I said it's got on-premises integration, there is no integration with your on-premises applications unless they support SAML or they require further configuration and resources. So that's where the sort of hybrid ADFS and pass-through authentication that I mentioned come in. So it's not like it's out of the box, integration with on-premises. You do need to put further resources in place. So that's, for me, is a bit of a downside. And the second con, or the downside, is that it obviously has a massive reliance on your Microsoft 365 tenancy. So any sort of outage, which I think are quite well documented, especially last year, there were a few big ones. So yeah, any sort of outage to Microsoft 365 can cause you a lot of issues. It can cause, especially if you have single sign-on, can cause those apps to stop working. It can stop you from accessing Microsoft 365 resources, so SharePoint and Exchange Online. So that reliance is a bit of a downside. So what I wanted to do was just do a bit of a demo around Azure AD and just go through the actual Active Directory dashboard and some of the settings you can go. I'm not going to go too deep dive, so I want to keep it short and sweet. So as you can see on the overview, you can either switch tenant, you can delete your tenant, create a new one, and you've got some areas here where you can manage your users. So click on that. We can see all the users that we have. I've not got many because this is just like my demo test tenant. And again, within that menu, we've got the users menu here. And we mentioned around the activity logs and reports all here on the left hand side that we can go for. Or we can look at password reset. again, within that, that has its own features. So as you can see, every time you click on one menu item, it takes you into another set of menu items. So these are all the properties for password reset. So we've got your on-premises integration that we mentioned, you know, your different authentication methods. We've got, again, usage and insights, audit logs for the reporting. You've got your administrator policy. And again, it's easy enough to go back out to the next menu where we were before. And again, even go one further and go back to the overview. And there we've got groups. Again, similar, you could go into any of these settings and they'll take you into another menu. To get back out, you can just go back into I am IT Geek. It takes you into the main menu again. Other quite interesting areas are, you know, your application integration. So you've got enterprise applications where you can essentially look at, you know, all the applications that you have registered, and you can look at configuring a single sign-on or application proxy we've got here. We can do some conditional access around our applications. And again, similar sort of theme here. You've got your sign-in activity logs, audit logs, and again, all your reporting that I mentioned was a massive benefit before. Again, let's go back out to the main menu where we were before. So we've got the licenses area here where you can look at who's got what licenses assigned to them. It's quite handy having it there. And this is for the on-premises hybrid integration, which we're going to go into next. So we can download the Azure AD Connect tool from here. We can install it onto our domain controller on premises. You know, I've not got a sync with this one, so it tells you where, you know, if you've got when the sync last ran, and then some stuff around your federation, if we've got any of those domains set up or not, is it enabled, password authentication. You know, gives you a lot of useful information around your hybrid identity management if you've got that solution in place. A bit further down, an area where we can add a custom domain if we want. Where we can add all the DNS records to verify it. Some area around Intune and your MDM and MAM policies here. So we click on either of these two and it'll take us into configuring those URLs if we want. Come back out. Again, company branding, which is quite essential to configure if you're wanting to use, you know, Autopilot or any other integration within Intune. Some further settings around the user settings here for your enterprise applications and any external users. Go into some of the properties of it here. You change the name, the technical contacts of your tenant. And this is quite an interesting one, quite an important one around security. So this is where we've got conditional access, your identity protection, security center if you're using that. Your identity secure score, which is always good, always fun to keep an eye on that to see if you can get a better score. And back to authentication methods, named locations, risky user reports, which we mentioned, obviously MFA as well, which is massively important. So that's a bit of an overview of the Azure AD tenant. What we'll do is now we'll move on to the next section of the presentation, which is more hybrid Active Directory identity management. So as I mentioned, the second type of identity management that I want to discuss in this presentation within Azure is hybrid identity management. So a hybrid identity is where you have an Active Directory domain on premises, on a Windows server, and you have Azure AD in the cloud. And you use a tool called Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Sync to synchronize those objects from on-premises to your cloud Azure AD tenant. So within this hybrid section that we're going to discuss, you know, there are three main ways in which you can set up hybrid identity, all via the Azure AD Connect tool, and I'm going to discuss some of those coming up. So what I'll discuss is the first one, which is password hash. I will discuss some of the pros and cons around password hash. We'll then go into some information around PTA or pass-through authentication. Again, similar, I'll go into some pros and cons of pass-through authentication. The final method I'll discuss is federated ADFS. And again, I'll finish off by discussing some pros and cons around ADFS federated. So password hash sync, how does it work to start with? So Azure AD Connect synchronizes a hash of your user password from an on-premises Active Directory instance to a cloud-based Azure AD instance. So your Active Directory on premises stores your passwords in the form of a hash value representation or your actual user password. And to synchronize your password, Azure AD Connect Sync extracts that password hash from your on-premises AD instance. Passwords are synchronized on a per user basis and are in chronological order. So as I mentioned, it's all like one pane of glass. You don't have the sort of OU segmentation that you would in Active Directory on premises. And also password hash sync is extra security processing is applied to the password hash before it's synchronized to your Azure Active Directory authentication service. So again, it adds extra security to your sync. So let's move on to discuss some of the pros and cons of password hash. So to start off with, the scale and resiliency of password hash is a massive positive. Since that it's all native to Azure, there's no reliance on anything during authentication. So if you think about if you were for some reason to lose your Active Directory domain on premises, your users would still be able to authenticate to Microsoft 365 because their identity is synchronized already, and so the same password would still work. So there's less resilience on your on-premises infrastructure, which again is I believe is a massive positive. There's a good security around password hash as well. It provides breach, replay protection, and reports of leaked credentials, since the stored hash can be used to compare against credentials found on the dark web. So again, there's another layer of security around the password hash sync. So looking at the cons, the main drawback for me is that if your Active Directory account has been locked on premises, or you've got restricted hours set, or even if your password's expired, it won't impact your ability to log in via Azure AD. So you could still essentially log into Microsoft 365 via the web, or your apps that are stored in the cloud will still work if you're locked out or you've got restricted hours. So it's a bit of a backdoor for me. So again, there's a bit of less security in that sense. Where this is where federated and pass-through authentication probably are preferred authentication and synchronization methods for this reason alone, really. So this will move us nicely on to pass-through authentication or PTA. So PTA it allows users to sign into both on-premises and cloud-based applications using the same password. So you can combine pass-through authentication with your single sign-on features. So when users are accessing applications on their corporate machines inside their network, they don't need to type the passwords in; it'll just auto log them on. Or if you have an Azure AD join device as well, or a hybrid device, again you combine PTA with single sign-on. So that's a really good feature. So let's look at some of the pros and cons of pass-through authentication. So some of the pros: it's lighter than your fully fledged ADFS federation services. Doesn't require as much on-premises resources or implementation, so it's a lot easier to manage. And also you can enforce restrictions on premises, and they'll apply to your cloud synced account as well. So it's got that restriction enforcement as well, which is a really good feature. One of the main cons of it is, or the drawbacks, is the sort of legacy authentication you can still use with it. Microsoft 365 and Azure in general are massively pushing modern authentication, and with pass-through it still supports those legacy authentications, so that's probably one of the drawbacks of it for me. So let's move on to the final sort of sync available within the hybrid identity, which is federated or ADFS. So first of all, some of the features include domain trust. So a collection of domains that have established a trust, essentially. The level of trust may vary, however, but typically it includes authentication and almost always authorization. You can federate your on-premises environment with Azure AD and use this federation for authentication authorization, as I mentioned before. The sign-in method ensures that all users' authentications occur on premises. So it's got a bit more reliance on your on-premises infrastructure. And this method allows administrators to implement more rigorous levels of access control. So, if you've got strict security policies that you need to implement as a business, then, ADFS or Federation is a good option for you. Let's finish off this hybrid section with looking at the pros and cons of Federation or ADFS. So the first positive or pro is that it supports third-party MFA and custom policy and claims rules. So it's got good third-party MFA integration. It's certification-based authentication, which is for me is one of the most secure types of authentication you can get. So again, it's a bit more work, but it's a better level of authentication, in my opinion. Unfortunately, there are probably more drawbacks for Federated than the other two sync options. One of them being a large resource footprint, so you do need on-premises servers, ADFS servers, proxy servers. You could have multiple servers depending on how large your infrastructure is. So, a large amount of infrastructure is required. And again, because it's got the on-premises element to it and resources, you normally need firewall exceptions, especially with your ADFS proxy, which in best practice says that it should really sit in a DMZ sort of network area. So again, you've got firewall exceptions that you need to think about. And again, because of all these other two negatives and drawbacks, it can limit the scalability of it. There's only a certain amount of servers that you can keep on adding into your farm before it just becomes unmanageable. So that's, again, another drawback for me. So now we'll move on to the final part of my presentation that I wanted to discuss, which is Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So in this part of the presentation, what I'll do is I'll explain what Azure AD Domain Services is, how does it work, and I'll go through some of the features within Azure AD Domain Services to give you an idea of some of the positives and negatives around it. So what is Azure AD Domain Services, or Azure AD DS for short? So Azure AD Active Directory provides managed domain services such as domain join, group policy, lightweight directory access protocol, or LDAP for short, and also Kerberos and NTLM authentication. So these are all very similar to your on-premises sort of Active Directory. You use these domain services without the need to deploy, manage, or patch domain controllers in the cloud. So there's no virtual machines. This is a domain controller as a service essentially. So how does Azure AD Domain Services work? So to provide the identity services, Azure creates an ADDS managed domain on a virtual network or a VNet of your choice essentially. So you need to make sure you've got that virtual network within Azure provisioned before you provision your managed domain. And Azure AD Domain Service integrates with your existing Azure AD tenant. So again, as we mentioned, there's a sync with on-premises to Azure AD. With Azure AD Domain Services, that in turn synchronizes with Azure AD instance. So this integration lets your users sign into services and applications connected to your managed domain using their existing credentials. So again, you can domain join VMs and users can log into that. You can also provide existing groups and user accounts to secure access to resources, and these features provide a smoother lift and shift of on-premises resources to Azure. So again, if you've got applications that require domain authentication or LDAP, then Azure AD Domain Services is a good choice to help you with your integration. So to finish off this section and also the presentation, I'll just go through some of the features of Azure AD Domain Services. So the first one, which is probably one of the main ones, is domain join. So unlike with Azure AD, you can join Windows devices, so they could be Windows 10 or Server OS to an Azure AD Domain Services, as long as the device can access the subnet that the Azure AD Domain Services instance sits on. So the virtual network within Azure that your ADDS sits on, that has to have access to that. So if, for example, you had an on-premises Windows 10 device or a virtual machine that needed to access it, you'd have to have a network or on-premises infrastructure with a VPN, a site-to-site VPN, to your Azure network, your Azure VNet. So again, that would allow the connection. So the other feature is highly availability. So Azure AD Domain Services includes multiple domain controllers which provide high availability for your managed domain. So when you are provisioning it, you always get 2 IP addresses, and those are normally for your DNS. So that's, again, it shows that it's got high availability in the back end. You don't manage those as the admin. You don't manage those; they're all managed by Microsoft, but you still get given 2 IP addresses. So the integration with Azure AD, again, is a good feature. So user accounts, group memberships, and credentials are automatically available from your Azure AD tenant. One thing that sometimes a lot of people miss, the fact is that once you've provisioned your Azure AD Domain Services, you actually have to get your Azure AD users to change password, because what that then does is the sort of the password hash that's used by Azure AD, that needs to basically convert into a password that's supported with domain services, essentially. So you have to get them to change their password before they can utilize any resources. So new users, groups, or changes to attributes from your Azure AD tenant or your on-premises Active Directory environment, they're automatically synchronized to Azure AD Domain Services, which is, again, another really good feature. Finally, your Kerberos and NTLM authentication. With support for NTLM and Kerberos authentication, you can deploy applications that rely on Windows integration for authentication. So again, it gives you more access to application authentication, which is really good, and another great feature. So that brings to an end my presentation. So thank you everybody for watching. If you have any comments or you have any questions, please do reach out to me. Don't forget to use the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021. And again, thank you to the organisers of Scottish Summit, and thank you to the sponsors as well. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of the content available, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you, and goodbye.